Welcome to the Church of God Network podcast, everybody. I'm here this time with Mr. Dan Apartian from Illinois. He's a deacon in the UCG congregation is it Bloomington? Is that where you're from, or is that where the congregation
Where
is?
I live, and the church is 45 minutes away in Morton, so we just call it Central Illinois.
Okay, I gotcha. And so he's on the podcast because we're talking about a subject that is very relevant to a lot of people, and you can tell it is because every time Dan gives this particular message, which is the differences between first and second generation Christians, the thing goes viral. People who reach out to me from all different kinds of Church of God groups about that sermon, and it's for you longtime CGN supporters, you'll realize that it was one of the first ones we featured in our Sermon of the Month series a couple of years ago. But it's a very good message. I highly recommend you check it out. We'll link to it in the description. But it's also a subject worthy of further discussion beyond the message and what he provides in the sermon. And I know it's a subject that's near and dear to many people, not just from the perspective of the second generation Christians, but also first. And just to clarify terms here, first generation Christian, I think, is sort of self-evident to folks. And we're sort of lumping in second generation Christians with people who may be third or fourth. I mean, the dynamics do change as you get deeper into this, but the distinction is basically people who came into the church from a different religion or belief set versus folks who grew up in the community. And of course, Dan and I were talking beforehand that no one's actually born into the faith. You have to choose, but it's a term that we use to sort of differentiate generational differences and differences in experiences with folks. But with that, Dan, why don't you give your background and a little bit of your history in the Church of God for folks.
Sure, be my pleasure, and thank you again for inviting me. Like you said, I live in Illinois now, but I was born in California. I went to both of the campuses in Pasadena and Big Sandy. Got my master's from USC after that. I've worked with State Farm for 34 years in a whole lot of different careers, 9 or 10 within the same company. Most of them been in leadership. And that's what's had me moved here, Virginia, starting in California. And then personally, I was married for 22 years to Renee Hancock Apartian. She died about 8 years ago of cancer. And so we have a son now who is Andrew or Drew. He's turning 20 in September. So life's crazy. It
That's
flies
awesome.
by. But I think that's the main part. Yeah.
Yeah, you certainly been through quite a lot in your life. And I know our paths sort of crossed in a secondary way. You went to Ambassador with my mom and my aunt back in the day. And I don't think I've ever met your son, but I hope to one of these days. And another weird connection, my best friend works for Progressive. So like, I don't know if that's a rivalry between the companies, but
oh, good.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you for that background. So in terms of the topic, you've been giving this message for years, actually. I think you just recently gave a new iteration of it, but I know there's one from like 2016, and I'm pretty sure you've given iterations of it over the years. Maybe not all of them get on the UCG website. But can you talk a bit about why this topic is important to you personally?
Sure, be glad to. And I think part of my bio that I didn't include might fit in well there, that the older generation in the church would know me as the son of Dan Apartian. And so my dad was an evangelist in Worldwide Church of God. He started all the French-speaking churches around the world, was a radio, television presence, and involved in the literature and all the rest. So in that way, he was a public figure. And I grew up attending the oldest version of Imperial schools. I grew up around well-known personalities in the church. So as a child growing up, I heard the Christian journey described by these pillars or these people who were older, and they described an experience that didn't match what I was experiencing. That bothered me, and that made me wonder if my calling was real. That's really what had me confused as a young child, as a teen growing up. And I should give credit to where credit deserves. The first time I ever heard the contrasts in any way presented was Bernie Schnippert when I was a teen, and he gave a message that I remember thinking, "Wow, okay, I never understood that." Um, and so through time, through that, and then trying to look it over myself, it's just discovering that there are very, very different ways between that God works with first and second generation Christians. And I think you did a great job casting the way I break it up. But if you came into the church in your maturity where you were choosing, you did the research, that's what a first generation Christian is. And there's people I know who are in their teens and describe their situation. I say, sure, that's your scenario. If you are born into the church, I refer to it as a second generation Christian, knowing full well there are third, fourth, fifth generation Christians, but the contrast is best to lump that group as a second.
Yeah.
And it can be a different dialogue for somebody else in the future to really talk about the differences between third and fourth. I mean, it
Mhm.
makes for fascinating talking, but I don't know that it's black and white. Um, but that difference is palpable, and it impacts how people see God's calling or God's truth or being baptized, being a first fruit, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
So that's
And,
the driver.
and it's also, just for reference, you and I both are second generation. Or are you technically third? I remember you saying you're like 2.5 or something.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to call me a second. My
Yeah.
mom came into the church the time her mom was. And so in that way, they both were coming into it into around the same time. So sure, is there a third generation there? But they entered around the same time. So it's
Yeah.
depends how you want to refer to that.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's the only real experience we can speak to. I'm sure there are differences when your parents are second generation. I'm sure like every nuance adds a bit of complexity to the experience, or just maybe changes it a bit. Um, but yeah, my experience in general terms was similar. I think I told you that the first time I ever did any sort of public speaking thing in the church, I was like 15 or 16 at a feast, and they had this youth day, and so a couple of us guys got to give these sermonette type things, and the topic I chose was, I don't think it was called the same thing, but it was essentially the difference between first and second generation Christians. And so I can definitely empathize with what that felt like growing up, especially. My people might have heard me talk about my experience in some of the other podcasts in terms of when I got to adulthood and went through largely my 20s, that I went through quite a few things that made me understand conversion in a different sort of way, even though I was baptized at 18. But to your point, I think that's the function of when you come into the understanding, in terms of when you grow up around it and you think you need to make the decision in your late teens, it's different than someone who does not grow up with that expectation. And maybe they wind up in a place where they're looking for meaning or something because life has already hit them.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Very true.
I'm sure there are like a million different ways this is relevant to the Church of God. But in your experience, you mentioned anecdotally your conversations with peers and whatnot, and of course your own experience. But how do you see this topic being relevant to the church at large?
It's one of those topics that I think the way, because it's resonated so much, it speaks to how unspoken it is, and therefore how palpable it is. It's the unspoken realities that are oftentimes the most revealing. So when I was growing up, I never realized that my friends felt the same thing until I first started to share it, and then boy, you'd get a whole lot of energy in the room picking up because everybody would talk about it. I just felt like I was unusual and that something was wrong with how God was working with me, because it was different than how he worked with my mom and my dad and those I
Yeah.
knew around. But I think that from there, the difficulties um, get even more exacerbated because of that fact that they aren't spoken of. So there's a lot of repressed Christians, in a sense, who feel inside that what's going on is inconsistent and different, and therefore there must be something wrong with it. When the reality is, what they're saying in many ways is probably true for more than half the people in the churches of God these
Mm-hmm.
days, but that doesn't make it spoken of. So what tends to happen is when those differences aren't understood or respected, then they breed these misunderstandings, right? And discouragement and judging and criticism. and shame, and
Hmm.
ultimately all that leads to a parting of the ways. And what ends
Yep.
up is kids leaving their parents' church, which isn't what's desired. And that's where the confused parents say, "What happened?"
And that's and
But you got
that's
to go back.
there's so much to unpack there too, because even the last thing you said, when parents go, "What happened?" I my family's a little bit of an anomaly in that both of my brothers, or me and my brother, both of us came into the church. We're baptized relatively young. I was 18. I think he was maybe 19 or 20. And I mean, it's a blessing to have
Yeah.
both members of the family, both of the young folks stay in the church. But it's also not people are taking a point in time snapshot of someone's life. And so when I have spoken to folks who are older and have older kids and they lament that fact, I'm like, you don't know what's going to happen. Like, this might be exactly what they need. And it's not a platitude, because yeah, I might have been baptized, but I went through a lot in my 20s. So I know these people are going to go through things too. You can't go through life and go through adulthood without going through really intense experiences. And it's not about where you are at this moment. It's a progression of understanding and experience. So that number one is a big thing. And then number two, to your point about uh, the shame, that is also something we didn't even talk about that in planning for this, but it's definitely something that sticks with me, because shame is at the root of so many issues in the human experience in general. I mean, let alone in the church, but it also has a self-reinforcing effect, where whatever the issue is at play, if shame enters the picture on that front, it's probably not going to help solve the issue. It's probably going to push that person further away, or make them feel more like an outcast, to your point. And I know something else that's very important to you and is important to me is, not only do those issues not get spoken to your point, and they become repressed, but there becomes a sort of splitting of the generations in the church, where, and I think it's exacerbated if you're in a big group. I didn't grow up in a large congregation, but I have noticed in my travels that if a congregation is bigger, um, all the kids stay by themselves, like young people by themselves, and the older generation by themselves, and you don't have the intermingling, and you lose so much access to expertise and wisdom if you're young, or maybe the energy and new ideas of people who are younger if you're part of the older generation. So there's a lot of impact of this issue.
Oh, absolutely. I think as like you said, we could unpack this and we could talk for hours on this whole topic, but there is certainly where I'll talk later about making that emotional connection. Shame is an emotion, and they're all about what it takes to get past whatever the blockers are. And shame is one of them, or confusion, or feeling like you don't belong. All of them go together. But all of that is, we're all trying to become one, right? We're all trying to become one part of God's family.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to realize there are two very different paths to get there.
Yeah.
I think that's at the core of it. And that's why when I've given this message, I first gave it, I was reflecting before I got on this call, and I think it was roughly 30 years ago. I first did something to a teen group in California. And then it's every 10 or 15 years, something inspires me to do it, and then it goes viral. And humbling things like this happen, or speaking of Winter Family Weekend or whatever else, there's been different things that have happened, which has nothing to do with me. God deserves the credit. And the most humbling thing to me about this message has been, there has been at least 5 people who I've never met, absolute strangers. 2 of them at least were from different countries around the world, that felt the need to reach out to me and say this message was the catalyst to them being baptized. I've never met these people. If that happened, that means there's probably a multiple of that that just never reached out. It's that pertinent of a topic
Yeah.
that, I'm just grateful to be a conduit.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to I've had that experience just in general with folks, that when you can tell someone's honest, they're being genuine, and it's coming from a place of experience, people respond to that. And so, we're talking about the differences between the generations and their experiences. maybe we can get into what those actually are, because I'm sure there might be some folks who are not aware that there are significant differences in the conversion experiences of people that come in for the first time versus those who grow up in it. But maybe you could speak to that a bit as well.
Sure. So let me first of all focus on two of them. I'll expand a little bit more. I think I've done in the sermon, but I think the key to think about would be around the timing of our calling and the method of our calling. So I'll contrast it a little bit. So the timing of a first generation Christian's calling was in their adulthood, right? And it was in a way that was very direct, and it created a story that created a contrast between what they had been doing and living and what they suddenly realized they should be doing. So very direct, and there was a contrast. To a second generation Christian, we were called in our youth. We were born into the church with this invite from God. And so our calling was expected. It was indirect. And that's not just a passing fact, it's a very poignant one, because so many children of believers expect something dramatic and different to happen. So many young people long for this ta-da moment where, it's as if you can close the door, which I would argue is why some people go and sow their wild oats, because they create their own ta-da moment. Then they can suddenly say, oh, now I see why I need God.
Yeah, inadvertently that does happen. I feel that one. Yep.
Yeah, so we were called to this birthright, but our calling can make us feel like misfits in God's plan without understanding the differences. That then leads to the next part, which I think plays in a lot to where the challenges come in, and that's around the method of our calling. So the way that plays through is for the first generation, well, they came from this world that they now see as evil. They began studying this teaching that challenged their lifestyle. It was very different. And so they then had this zeal and fervor that built up for what they were learning and reading and understanding, to find this church that taught this difference and then hold on to it like this precious treasure. Mm-hmm. So there's risk involved, right? There's letting go of things from the past. For a second generation Christian, we weren't driven by any kind of intellectual curiosity. We were forced to attend and be quiet and sit on that blanket down there on the floor, and don't you dare make a peep, and this service may go a long, long time depending on who's speaking. So we operated on this rote obedience first and trained to live God's way long before we ever validated that it was the right thing to do, and it became a conviction. So I'll kind of play those together, and then we can chat on this a little bit. But yeah. So the impact, how this matters, is I look at it like three stages, and when one of the stages is missed, that's often the void for where people leave the church. So for first generation Christians, it starts academically. They scour the truth, then they emotionally commit to it, and then they practice it. Mm-hmm. So academics, emotions, practice. For second generation Christians, we practiced, we applied it first, and we were praised for doing it. Good for you. You can answer this Bible question. We often skip that next step and we never prove it. Yeah. First generation Christians prove it, then apply it, and that brings the emotions involved. Yeah. But for a second generation Christian, if we never prove it, we will never have that same emotional connection. And that's why it gets lost and people get angry. So why don't you feel the pressure of what you have? And the analogy I'd used in the sermon was, I said, people don't get excited every morning and go, oh, the sun's rising. Oh, the sun's rising. Oh, it rose again. It's repeat. It's routine. We've done it since birth. Mm-hmm. It's understanding of how you fit that in.
I tell you, though, if you're someone, I happen to know one of my favorite musicians tells this story, and he's a very positive guy. He had a experience when he was younger, maybe in his teens, where he almost died. He had an illness and almost died. That contrast will give you the perspective to value every day when you wake up. And I love that statement you made about contrast. I think that is so much at the heart of it, because and I know from experience talking with my folks that the the intellectual understanding, whatever it is that like onboarded you into this, in every person has their own, whatever, like doctrinal understanding, or, and it's so stark. It's such a contrast from what you grew up learning in your church, or whatever your assumption was about Christianity, that it hooked you. And it wasn't really that hard to convince you of the whole moral thing, that you have been living a certain way and that way is bad. Because you're like, oh yeah, of course. Like this, the initial thing that got my attention was so stark. Of course, I know I've been living this way. It's such a stark difference. When in for second generation folks, and I'll speak from my own experience, is that I think it might sound a little harsh. I don't mean it this way, but there's an element of almost being pharisaical as you grow up, where you know things intellectually, but you don't have that. It's not quite real to you in the same way. And I don't mean that in like a derogatory way. I'll give myself even some benefit of the doubt that when you are 16, 17, 18, 19, you just haven't lived that long, and you haven't had that many responsibilities, and you just haven't, there hasn't been enough time. And for me, what happened again, I love that word. It's that contrast. For me, the contrast wasn't intellectual understanding. It was that, oh, I'm actually not what I thought I was. I'm not as good as I thought I was. I've been given a lottery ticket in my life, and I benefited from that lottery ticket. And now, like, the money's running. Like, I gotta go get a job and make this my own. You know what I mean? Like, and as a result, there winds up, at least for me, there wound up being this almost desperation, this need to go back. And it wasn't necessarily to prove it, like I was going to argue with someone, but when you see that contrast in yourself, and you're like, wow, I need this. It's not like, oh, this is the best of a bunch of alternatives. You sort of acknowledge your need and your longing for a relationship with God, and a lot of those other things tend to come about as a result. And again, since it is progression, might happen in my 20s, but who knows when an individual's moment is going to happen, or how it's going to happen, or in what way. I'm sure it's also very dependent on your kind of personality, and God knows what works with you and what doesn't, and what gets you motivated and excited about the calling. But that's a fantastic point.
I mean, the truth is, you see a lot of very experienced first generation Christians who frankly go down rat holes of thinking they now need to find the newest little nuance of some silly thing that makes their knowledge power higher than anybody else's, and throw away all that God taught about how we're supposed to live and act and what true Christianity is. It's this understanding of, so there's this part of what we're asked to do is obedience, and part of it is loving a loving, gracious God. I would argue that those who came in as first generation Christians started by learning, they had the contrast. They probably brought up with the churches that taught a lot about grace and love. Then they realized what the obedience was, and they're like, oh, there's choices in here. For us coming into the church, sure, we got hammered over the head with obedience. You know, you can use this concept of law, but this is a different thing than, you know, let's not get into bickering over Old Testament law, New Testament law, any of that. It's obedience. Well, you don't feel the emotional connection to your creator when you were slapped on the hand for making a squeaky noise at 4 years old in the middle of a church.
Yeah.
We have to come through some of these hard times to appreciate our merciful, gracious, loving God, because we realize how much we don't do right, or how much we need God's help. Then that connects our obedience and love to the God who still loves us, even though we don't obey as well as we should.
And it's just and you come to not terms, but you realize the intensity and the excitement and the meaning of the calling in a much bigger way. One of my favorite analogies is one that Gary Petty made one time, where he is saying that a lot of people think, and I think second generation Christians like myself fell into this category, which is you think, oh, I'm decent. Yeah, I'm not perfect, but like the conversion is God looking at me going, okay, I need to replace the windows, need some more paint. And he said, no, it's a gut job. You get torn down, the foundation gets ripped up, and a new foundation is laid. Everyone goes through that. So like that is such a key difference in experience. And of course, we acknowledge every generation is also affected by the realities of that generation in the world. Like all of us go through different experiences, different historical time periods impact us in different ways. But yeah, that's a great synopsis of the two main issues that at least I've seen come about as a result of this. So do you want to speak again, because you and I both have experienced this firsthand? Can you speak a bit to the dangers? Maybe that's not the right word, but the what happens when you don't make it your own, or you're sort of in it, or make a commitment before you've done that, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, I'll use an example from my own life that is an embarrassing one, but it to me exemplifies what the younger generation growing up in the church can do, because we parrot and we can pass multiple test quizzes of what we've heard in church, but doesn't mean for a second we understand what we're doing. We just can answer multiple choice questions. So I grew up in California, and Imperial School closed in third grade. So I'd been this very sheltered little school growing up. And I think it was fifth grade. It was shortly after that I was in the public schools in the area. And just again, I guess for a microcosm comparison to understand the background I was coming through. In California, I think at that time it was 67% minority. So I was used to people of all color, was not prejudiced in any sense, but also was a smart aleck little kid. So I went to these schools that prided themselves on being even more diverse than the cultures around them. So it was probably like 15% Caucasian. Was in this one class. I don't even know what class or why it came up, but somehow the topic of interracial marriage came up. So again, context, I'm a 10-year-old. And they asked for thoughts. And here's a little smart aleck Dan raised my hand. I say, it's wrong. And everybody looked at me. And they said, why? And I said, the Bible. And they said, where? And of course, I had no clue. I just heard somebody somewhere in church, and for context, because the church changed shortly after that. But I'll fill in that, I then went home to my dad and I told him what happened, because I started to be calling Prejudice Dan. And my dad said, well, I'm sorry you went through this, but this might be a very good life lesson for you, not to spout concepts without proving why you do what you do. So let me tell you what the church says. Let me tell you now what I think the Bible is intending to say. And so at that time, it was this thought about why was Israel supposed to leave the other tribes? And there have been different interpretations. Was it about separating colors, or was it about cultures? Was it about religions? And my dad said, so here's where it's gone. It's vacillated in the history of our church many times. I believe it's about religion, separating religions. You need to figure out what you think the Bible says, but you should not be spouting things as from the Bible if you can't prove them. And for a year, I was called Prejudice Dan. Now, obviously, I'm learned more from that. I very quickly looked at the Bible. I'm like, yeah, Dad, that's, but I mean, it is what it is. It's less about that versus the fact that we can understand things, or we can hear things, but never really get to the depth of knowing how to defend it. So we just spout things off.
That's also a very special guy, your dad, in order to have, in terms of not only for him to be able to take that, have that conversation with you, but to be in the position he was in, and to be that blunt and direct, and to be that confident in his own process and development, to encourage you to do the same thing. Because I mean, now I'm very fortunate too that I had two parents, and a father in particular who's also a minister. So we're both, I'm not a PK because he wasn't a pastor, but and that, I think that also highlights some ways in which the generations can interact better too, because that's so impactful when you have an older person in the church not like chastise you, but encourage you, and not like, and also not enable the parroting. Like you said, it's like, well, I don't even believe that. This is my understanding of that. I don't agree 100% with whoever said that to you. But you can navigate that, still operate within the context of the church with a variety of opinions positively, and then encourage this young person to find out for themselves without fear of retribution if their conclusion isn't the same as your father's. I remember one of the most impactful things for me when I was a kid, I think I was a bit younger than you in that story, but I always loved sitting around and listening to my parents and their friends talk in the church. I always found it very interesting and very exciting. And I remember one time they were talking about something, and my dad looked over at me and went, "Well, what do you think?" And I just went, "Yeah, I don't know." And I said, "You want to know what I think?" He goes, "Yeah, yeah, we want to know what you think. You're a part of all this too." And just the encouragement of
Absolutely.
of what do you think about this? What's going through your mind is so powerful. I mean, it sticks with me to this day. So you have to acknowledge that. Kudos to your dad, and I think that's an encouraging example for other people who might have younger folks in their lives.
And yours as well. And we can talk later about some different recommendations for first generation Christians, but part of it is allow people to question things, allow people to ask the uncomfortable questions, because that's part of proving, right? And until we prove why we do what we've done, the truth is that generation in the church is going to leave because it's going to get too hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're the only way to get to an emotional connection to believe to what we do is by proving it, so we appreciate how great our God is. And then we start getting comfortable in church because it's our church and we can have these conversations. That's what happens when we combine conviction with proving that leads to emotions. And if we don't prove, then we won't get there. I mean, one analogy I used in the message was that our parents or the first generation Christians had to fight to enter the church because they were having to give up things that they had done and their families had done and they were shaped in. Our fight is to stay in it.
Mm-hmm.
And without proving it, we'll lose that fight and we're going to lose it to complacency.
It's a great point. I was just going to bring that up, that when people who came in from outside of the church had to question everything to come in. I mean, they're questioning fundamental beliefs that they had about their life, about their faith, about what they were largely given by their parents or the culture they grew up in. And there's a wide variety of, I mean, not everyone's like your father or mine or a lot of other people I know, and not everyone is the opposite. But if you do take that posture towards a young person where you're sort of, maybe without realizing it, disincentivizing proving things or disincentivizing questions, you're shortcutting them of the same exact experience you went through to get there. And the freedom to question and ask about things that don't make sense in your life, that's what leads to the excitement and the motivation. And ultimately, hopefully you come, and if you're being called, you have access to this, you come into the truth. But that's what creates a self-perpetuating, a self-motivated individual going through conversion. So yeah, that the contrast of needing to work to come in, to move, to make it your own, I think is a great point. So maybe we actually could get into some of that now, in terms of, so obviously there are differences, and without spending too much time on those, because again, it's important to get to know each individual person. It's never a one size fits all thing, but I think it probably is good to talk about bits of advice for the people in these two different situations. So maybe first, for the folks who are second, third plus generation in the church, what's some advice you might have from them, maybe some experiences you have that might help them?
Sure. First of all, I would say don't wait for something dynamic and unexpected before you get baptized, before you accept your calling, because it's not going to happen. God has opened the door for you to choose from birth. And so instead of looking for this before and after contrast, recognize you're going to see the changes in these little small, tiny, incremental movements of your spiritual journey throughout your life. So don't look for these massive pivots. Second generation Christians, I've often asked, do they really, do they want zeal and emotion? Absolutely, they want zeal and emotion. They want connection.
Mm-hmm.
But it's recognizing the path of the connection and helping the first generation also realize the path for the second generation. And it will only come by proving. You don't just obey. God doesn't want us to be robots. It's when we realize why we do what we do and how often we kill our Savior, how often we sin, how often and how evil we are without God. That goes back to that concept of realizing the merciful, loving, gracious God, which is the key part that I think sometimes those who came into the church, the first generation Christians, pushed aside, and they're like, well, I already know that side. Your kids don't.
Mhm.
Let them invest emotionally in different ways, and don't feel guilty because you're different, because there isn't one right way. God intentionally made this. I mean, I laugh thinking about the millennium. We're going to be dealing with 32nd generation Christians, and who knows what in the world we do there.
Mhm.
But there's no way a person born in the church can prove it before they apply it. You can't be upset at that.
Yeah.
But you have to make it yours. You have to prove it and individually choose to do what you've always done from a different way. And then the church starts having more meaning.
I agree. And I would also say from my experience, and this is something that it's not just during the time where I was learning these lessons in a hard way, but just it seems to be the lesson of life in general. I know from what you said about your own recent life experience and in your opening statements about your personal biographical information that there's a lot of struggle in life. And there's a lot of some struggle is external where it's nothing you did, it just happens. And a lot of stuff is our doing. And I think, and I didn't grow up this way, but as I've talked with other folks, my generation, younger in the church, I have noticed that one big thing a lot of second plus generation people come out of is this belief that I don't think is conscious, but I think might have become cultural, that there is a sort of karma dynamic in the church where I did all the right things growing up. I, went to church. I, waited till marriage for sexual whatever you want to call it. I married someone in the church, and there's no such thing as karma. I mean, I think it's what happens when up until that point of young adulthood, if we haven't been proving it by really being in scripture, like the only place you could find out is in scripture, then you get these misconceptions because you dig into to scripture and
Vanity of vanity, all is vanity.
yeah, and we're called to suffer with Christ. We're essentially like playing out what Christ went through, and the fact that we would think struggle is not an integral part is kind of wild. But it is. I think it's what people might accidentally be naturally steeped in. So I think I don't maybe embrace the struggle is the wrong word, but when it comes, like live in it, like think about it. Why, feel what there is to feel and mind that experience, what there is from what there is to learn.
Embrace the ick, and I think there is something to that in life. You can either let it take you all the way down, or you face tragedies like we all have in our life. You say that really stinks. You embrace the ick. You learn what you can, and you step forward.
Yeah. And that's how it's a big catalyst for growth. I mean, I think people can internalize that with other things in life, right? Getting into shape or pursuing your career. There's all kinds of understandings about, yeah, you got to fail and you learn from them. But in our personal lives with our own character, especially too, we don't want to go through that, but it is par for the course. And I think maybe the last thing I would add about for younger generations is probably a good segue into, I know, one of your suggestions for first generation Christians, and that is very often now in the church, those generations are separated by age group. Not always. Like I have someone who's around my age, or several folks who I know who came into the church from the world. So that's a same age group, but different experiences. But since in the church, we don't have that kind of influx from the world as much anymore, it's largely age related. So if you're a young person, I would encourage you actively try to form relationships across age demographics, because there's, first of all, they're great people. Like we're all brothers and sisters. They're fantastic individuals. They have great advice and stories. There's no reason why you can't literally be a great friend to someone who's 20 years older than you. It doesn't have to be your own age. And I think a lot of older folks might feel hesitant, like maybe I'm too corny or not cool enough and the kids don't want to talk to me. So take the initiative to yourself and go over and try to form those relationships.
Yep.
So what would you say to first generation Christians, maybe conversely?
Sure. I do think it's fascinating that the times I've given it, I'd say the first group that beelines up is first generation Christians, usually very apologetic and grieving and sad that things they didn't realize and how much they wish they could undo buttons for life. But it's just not understood. So don't cast the expectation that what was experienced by a first generation Christian is normal, because more than half the church now is second, third, fourth, or more. Ask them questions to go what you're saying when you have those conversations. Don't go being this authoritative tell. Ask questions to help them recognize their journey, to recognize the relationship with God and what they see differently now versus what they did before, or like your dad. So what do you think? Those are critical areas to help build a zeal, because it's creating ownership. Don't be impatient, don't be condescending, or refuse to let them question the non-black and white things, or the things that make you cringe. And don't make light out of how hard it is for a person born in the church to embrace it and the sacrifices that they have to go through. I mean, you have stories that I have them, my son has them. And I guess I'll poke the bear a little bit, but I also think there's an area where we need to just realize we are in a 1950s construct of a church in what we do for our services and our layouts. And, the 11th commandment is God said, have 3 songs, then have a sermonette, then have a single song, then have a sermon. There's things like that where a lot of times when I hear things being brought up of suggestions, people say, oh, that will make the older people uncomfortable. Well, would the older people in the church prefer not to have younger people in the church? I should say, allow the next generation to do some quote unquote more modern ways of worship that bring emotion into services. And I use the example of types of music, right? Travel to the Caribbean, they put rhythm tracks to Dwight Armstrong, which would frighten people beyond belief. You're like, for crying out loud, just a rhythm track in the background. Use of visuals, be pliable servants to allow and encourage others to grow in the way they need. And that will make you, may not be what you like or want. And it may feel Protestant because that's what you came from. But the question is it wrong? Or is that your bias? Is it against what God says of how we should worship? If so, then don't do it. Mm-hmm. If not, we all have to meet each other in the middle somewhere.
Exactly.
So
exactly. And that's a great point too. One of the things I've learned over the last couple of years is that love in any context is way more about willing to be uncomfortable for the other person. And that involves, again, the same way first generation Christians shouldn't be completely averse to that kind of change. Younger generations who have not grown up in that, they might not know the subtleties of having the conversations. The only way you find that out, talk with the older generation about what their issues are with, in this case, the music or whatever it is, format. But it can, you mentioned the 1950s construct. I think what's interesting is that the kind of accidental culture that emerged is sort of akin to the 50s and 60s, where you don't really question the established institutions or norms. And what's fascinating is that generation is populated by people who questioned everything to get in. and so I think it's a very human tendency, but you don't want to switch that thing off. I mean, healthy skepticism or curiosity is the catalyst for learning. And unfortunately, I haven't heard this from only one person. It's been multiple people, but that when they were growing up, they were literally afraid to do Bible study because what if I found something that disagreed with what the church taught? And that is terrifying. Like to have that mindset. And I don't know whether that was, again, you could internalize something accidentally that was not intended, whether maybe it was someone being overly dogmatic, but allowing.
Because oftentimes the insecurity of the person leading at that time, I think you and I were both blessed with spiritually sound, strong parents along the way who said, I want you to ask and let's talk. That makes it much more meaningful and much more real to know that there's not any forbidden questions, and to hear your parents say, I'm not sure what that means. Here's what I think it means.
Yeah.
But we're still learning.
And even the take it a step further and go, really? Why do you think that? I don't think that. Like sometimes we see someone parroting and they sort of are hoping that they're parroting correctly and want your approval, and it's a good teaching moment to go, actually, no, I don't I don't think that, or why do you, like, could you prove that if you needed to? And again, some individuals cultivate that atmosphere where, like, no, you, knowing what you believe is paramount, and that's a very important lesson to put in a young person's head growing up. Because I think the older you get, the harder it is. I mean, with anything, the harder it is to undo whatever mindset it is that you grew up with. But yeah, that's a fantastic point, and it goes for anything. If dynamism and going ever closer to the truth, pursuing the truth, it's a process, and like you said, it's predicated on everyone involved having the freedom to question, because if you can't, then you can't get to the truth. Even, I had a friend very recently, and it's sort of sad to watch as it's happening, where he, I don't think he had made his beliefs his own most of his life, and by his own admission. And so the last couple of years, he's been questioning everything, right down to the Sabbath and holy days, and he doesn't believe the holy days are needed, which, again, I do not agree with that. I think that is, you're throwing out truth. But if he had never proved it for himself, he has to go back and prove it. And if he can't prove it to himself, maybe he's not meant to be in the church. Like, that's fine. Like, it's
Yeah.
yeah.
I think one of the things that goes with that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Daniel, is a lot of times where they go is to the church that kicks up a lot more emotions, because that's also what they then gravitate that they didn't feel in this construct of what they've grown up in. People are all excited and passionate and talking, then everybody gets quiet, and it's a very calm thing for 2 hours, and then people get passionate and talk again. They go to services where there's emotion.
And until they learn that human beings are the same everywhere, that it's not, the grass isn't greener there, it's just a different kind of dysfunction. They have their own cliques and their own I mean, you go in the world and you talk about, oh well, the religious community, they're very open with how they feel, and open question, like, not people, a lot of people will laugh at you. Like, no community really, political or religious or otherwise. Sports teams, you can't question your own. If you're with a fellow Giants fan and you don't like the quarterback, they gotta tear your head off. Like, there's no room for questioning in society. So
yeah.
Yeah, so giving everyone in the church a benefit of the doubt as we navigate these things is hugely important. But with that, do you have any final remarks or last things you think that we might need to address that we haven't so far?
I don't know. I think we've covered a lot of them. I would just say, for a second generation Christian person, if you're contemplating baptism, don't get in the loop that so many do, thinking you have to be living perfectly, making no mistakes, address all your sins. If you do, you're missing the whole point. It's about making a commitment to a calling, because you recognize that our struggles and our weaknesses need God as the only true way to live. And so it's this nuanced difference in counting the costs. Yep. The first generation Christians had to make a very distinct contrast when they came into the church. And so there was a counting of the cost, because you're giving up Christmas and you're giving up family situations and a lot of other things that may have been part of your work reality. For second generation Christians, there's absolutely things that still have to be understood. But for the most part, they've been doing a lot of the things of counting the cost since birth. It's accepting the cost. And doing that is only going to come with willing acceptance. Only comes when you've proven it and you have that connection to your God. And I think that's the critical part. And then I guess the final thing for everybody is just bridge the gaps, work together. If we respect and work together, we will all be able to celebrate God's kingdom together.
Yeah. And I completely agree. The word I use often is it's commitment, counting the cost, of course. And I'm not married, and but so other people could speak to this better, but I'm sure it's similar, where you're going in realizing you don't really know what's coming because you haven't lived it. So you can't truly count the cost in actuality. But if you have the commitment, like, okay, I'm willing to try to work through whatever comes my way. I'm not going to leave the job site, as someone put it, which is a good phrase. Then you move forward, and that's sort of where faith comes in. So you have faith that God, that whatever you go through, if you're oriented towards God, that all things will work together for you because God is working with you, and he's not going to abandon you in your conversion if you don't leave the job site. And I think I know for me, I didn't obviously know all this at the time when I got baptized, but I do remember thinking, I think I just need to decide if I want to make the commitment. Because if you do wait for the emotional thing or the big experience thing, it might happen. But maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I mean, there's no way to forecast that. But I learned a lot of that stuff after baptism, which is fine. That's where you learn a lot of stuff. And to your point, I've heard plenty of people go, well, I don't feel like I've dealt with sin enough in my life to get baptized. Like, man, well, if you come to me and say that you now have, then I know you shouldn't get baptized, because like you're missing the point. But I think it very much is an understandable line of thinking to fall into, just because it is so common. So again, I think another common theme is don't beat yourself up. There's a lot more. It's a lot messier of a process, life and conversion, than maybe we talk about. Maybe we should talk about that more, but completely agree. Love all your points.
Well, thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for coming on, Dan. Really appreciate it. Again, everybody, highly recommend you listen to the message. We'll put in the link below. Maybe we'll put a few of the iterations in the link below. Again, he's got a handful of recordings out there. But thanks again, Dan. Really appreciate you coming on.
Have a great evening.